We are very fortunate to have one of the United Kingdom's, and indeed the world's, foremost metaphysicians and philosophers of religion. Robin Le Poidevin is Professor of Metaphysics at Leeds. He was editor of the Journal of Religious Studies from 2010 to 2015 and President of the Society for the Philosophy of Religion from 2009 to 2011. He's written mainly on the philosophy of time and on the attitude one should have to the question of the existence of God. His books include, and I added this one in, Change, Cause and Contradiction in 1991, Arguing for Atheism in 1996, Travels in Four Dimensions in 2003, The Images of Time in 2007, Agnosticism, a very short introduction, 2010, and Religious Fictionalism in 2019. His publications on religion have articulated a non-realist conception of religious life and language. Religious engagement is not to be based on belief in the existence of God. This may take an agnostic form, in which religious engagement is an experiment in living that leaves open the possibility that God is real, or it may take a fictionist form, in which religious language is taken to be an important fiction. His most recent work has been interested in the relationship between these two approaches. His publications on time have also related to the rejection of something important to many people. He has defended the view that, in reality, there is no such thing as the passage of time, and explained how this is compatible with our experience of time, something you may think about as time flies past you in the enjoyment of the lecture to come, giving his latest thoughts about the existence of God and the religious life. I now invite Robin Le Poidevin to give his lecture, after which there will be the opportunity for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction, Paul. After your first sentence, I wondered who else you'd invited to speak this evening. So, after I'd given for my title, Why I Am an Agnostic, I thought perhaps I should have entitled it something like Why I'm a Satanist or something of that kind, because that Why I'm an Agnostic sounds a rather tame title, a rather sort of cautious position, as if I'd entitled it something like Why I Like Brown Corduroy, or Why I Prefer Not to Have an Overdue Library Book. Because agnosticism can seem, well, perhaps a little bit dull. It's certainly represented as such, a rather timid position by some of the more loquacious public figures in debates on religion. Well, I don't think it is a particularly timid position. I think it's actually a rather interesting and a rather challenging position, and I think it can meet some of the objections that have been launched at it by both theists and atheists alike. But first, I'm going to inflict on you just a few vaguely autobiographical reflections. Not that I've got anything too shocking to reveal about my early life, at least not this evening. But I thought I would just say a little bit something, a few words about my own religious education and how that helped to shape my current view. Well, religious observance was not, I would say, a particularly regular feature of my early childhood. But when I first went to school, it did become so. So I went to a boarding school, and Sundays involved a regular trip to the local church. And for me, this was the highlight of the week, not perhaps primarily because of the religious experiences that I may or may not have had at that age, but it got me out of school grounds for a while, which was very welcome. Not that the trip to church was without its hazards. You had to avoid being pushed into a muddy ditch, and when you failed to avoid being pushed into a muddy ditch, you had to retrieve your hymn book, which was now in a very disreputable state, liable to get one into great trouble. But then there was the church itself, which, although as you can probably see, probably a fairly standard example of mid-Victorian Gothic architecture, was, I thought, rather beautiful, and it was in a lovely setting. And my brother, who went to the same school, attended the same church, used to say that whenever he read Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, he would set it in his imagination in the churchyard of this church. I think what those early church-going experiences taught me was the sheer aesthetic beauty of religion, the buildings, the art, the music, and the language. And our vicar, being somewhat traditionally minded, would insist upon the language of the authorised version. And there's something about the language of the authorised version which makes you feel it contains the mystery of existence, even though the nature of that mystery may itself be, in part, mysterious. Religious instruction took the form of what were called scripture lessons, and we went through various parts, the highlights of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Kings, onto Samuel, and so on and so forth. And it was taught, I think, with some flair by the local vicar. So I wouldn't say I had a strong faith, but I did have, I think, quite a good introduction to the Christian faith. And then I moved to secondary school. And this school had a strong Christian ethos. In fact, it had been associated with no less than 3 archbishops of Canterbury. William Temple was headmaster briefly for a while, his successor. Geoffrey Fisher, who was also his successor at Lambeth many years later. And Michael Ramsey, who had been a boy at the school, actually under Fisher's time, when Fisher was headmaster. And Fisher remarked much later on, when Michael Ramsey became Archbishop of York, that he hadn't actually beaten Ramsey when he was a boy at school, but if he'd known he was going to be Archbishop of York, he certainly would have done so. So these portraits would stare down at me when I sat in one of the rooms, and it's difficult not to be affected to some extent by that kind of sense of the history. I took confirmation classes. Again, these were informative and very well conducted. Our tutor reassured us, you won't have to recite the whole of the 39 articles. And I thought, what are the 39 articles? So you can see I wasn't particularly well informed at that stage. Both headmasters during my time there were, I think, had a very strong Christian outlook. And when the new headmaster took over, when I was in the 6th form, he courted controversy by moving daily morning assembly, which had been in the wholly secular main assembly hall, to the college chapel, the school chapel. This being, in his view, the centre of school life. Well, although there were strong Christian elements within the student population, there were also some determined pockets of resistance amid the same as well. And in those first few assemblies, there was prolonged hissing from the congregation, but that soon stopped. There was also annually a mission week, where a group of young people who I now imagine must have been members of university Christian societies would come and talk to us in a very engaging way and put on sketches and so on to lure us in by humour, and then there was the serious message. I went along dutifully to these things, also with a slight sense of embarrassment as well, which probably indicated that my faith was perhaps not wholly secure. And I sometimes wonder whether my current views of religion have been shaped to no small extent by simply a sense of social embarrassment. I don't think the emotion of embarrassment should be at all underestimated in the way in which our feelings are shaped. William James said, "Pretend what we may, the whole man within us is at work when we form our philosophical opinions. Intellect, will, taste, and passion cooperate just as they do in practical affairs." He probably wasn't thinking primarily of embarrassment when he was thinking of passion, but I think it shouldn't be ignored anyway. So at the end of my schooling, I think I would have described myself, perhaps with some reservations, cautiously, as a Christian. And then at some point in my university career, I encountered Don Cupitt, who at one stage, I think was certainly a name to be conjured with. Some of you may have heard of Don Cupitt, others may be hearing his name for the first time, but I encountered him in the 1980s, where he achieved quite a bit of fame, and in certain quarters, notoriety, for his TV series, The Sea of Faith, where he suggests a kind of Christianity which is not based on the objective existence of God. And of course, in some circles, people were, if not baying for his blood, then baying for him to be defrocked. But for me, this was an eye-opener. The idea of what was then termed a radical theology, or what Cupitt tended to refer to as a kind of a non-realist conception of Christianity and religious faith in general. So for Cupitt, religion was essentially an ethical matter, and that's very reminiscent of Matthew Arnold's conception of religion, articulated more than a century earlier than Cupitt, where Arnold defines religion as morality touched by emotion. But for Cupitt, as well as the ethical dimension of religion, there's also the symbolism. So it's important that we have, as he puts it, an imaginary focus. That imaginary focus being God. A non-real object, in Cupitt's view, but nevertheless exercising a very powerful effect on our imaginations, that we channel, as it were, our ethical thinking through this imaginary focus. So much then for my background. So let us turn to agnosticism itself and some of the concerns that have been, objections that have been raised to it. So, turning from Cupitt to a figure who I suppose is still a name to conjure with, Richard Dawkins. In his well-read book, very influential book, The God Delusion, Dawkins has a section which he calls The Poverty of Agnosticism, from which you can gather that he's not exactly a fan of agnosticism. And in that section of the book, he imagines a scale of belief or beliefs ranging from total certainty that God exists to the other extreme, total certainty that God does not exist, leaving quite a lot of room in between for agnostic positions of one sort or another. Less than total certainty in God's existence or non-existence, and meeting in the middle with a sort of 50-50 either way. That's a lot of room, as I say, for agnosticism. It's taking up a lot of space. And if you conceive it in that way, if you think that agnosticism is essentially all the space between absolutely certain theism, belief, absolutely certain atheism, it covers a pretty broad spectrum. Lots of things could be called agnostic. And Dawkins quotes a friend of his who describes himself as a tooth fairy agnostic. What does that mean? Well, he's agnostic about God in the way that he's agnostic about the tooth fairy. Of course, he doesn't believe the tooth fairy exists, but would be stumped to come up with an absolutely compelling proof that the tooth fairy does not exist. Sometimes I would put one of my milk teeth under the pillow. I haven't done this for a very long time. And there would be a sixpence sometimes in the morning. And I never actually got to see, what the mechanism was. So there's always that kind of slight room for doubt. Could it be the tooth fairy or not? And the idea is that, of course, we don't believe in the tooth fairy, but if we're pushed, we might have to say that we are tooth fairy agnostics if we can't come up with a suitably compelling proof. So, if that's what it is to be agnostic, you can be agnostic about God in the way that we're agnostic about tooth fairies, it doesn't seem to be a particularly interesting position. So for Dawkins, our uncertainty about, or his certainty that God does not exist may not be absolutely 100%, but it's getting that way. And if you call that agnosticism, you can call it agnosticism. But why does he think that the probability of God's existing is about as low as the probability of the tooth fairy existing? And I think there are two main considerations. One, of course, is the progress of science. That science, for Dawkins, has provided the kinds of explanations for the kinds of phenomena that at one stage we might have appealed to God to explain. But I think there's a more kind of fundamental principle at work here, and it's one that I want to spend a little time talking about and questioning. We can call it the presumption of atheism. That the default position is that of atheism, and that the onus is on the theist, the believer, to establish the existence of God. Now, we have to be very careful here. This phrase, the presumption of atheism, was coined, or at least made prominent by Anthony Flew. But he distinguishes between what he calls positive atheism, which is the denial of God's existence, and negative atheism, weaker position, which is simply the absence of theistic belief. Atheism, or an atheist if you're simply not a theist, rather than necessarily someone who's actually going to deny it. So when he talks about the presumption of atheism, it's the presumption of negative atheism, simply absence of theistic belief, which looks the more neutral position. But I think behind Dawkins' thinking behind a lot of people's views on this topic is a presumption of positive atheism. Start by assuming that there isn't a God in the way that you might start by presuming that there isn't a pink elephant somewhere in this room, until you're actually given positive reasons for thinking that there is. But whichever of these presumptions you take, the presumption of positive atheism, presumption of negative atheism, looks as though the theist owes us a proof, or at least some sort of argument in favour. But it makes a big difference whether you think the default position is positive atheism and negative atheism. Now, how are we going to decide who has the onus of proof? Who owes us a demonstration or an argument in favour of their position against the, as it were, default position? Is the onus on the theist? Well, here we need to talk about the balance of probabilities. Two kinds of probability are at issue here. A priori and a posteriori probabilities. And when we talk about probability in this context, what we're talking about is our degree of confidence in a particular hypothesis or proposition. How inclined am I to believe this? What degree of confidence can I invest in this thought? So it's not probability in the statistical sense. So if I said to Paul here, you have a 10% chance of being left-handed, I'm not saying anything about you in particular. You have this curious property of being, 10% liable to be left-handed. I'm simply reporting the statistical fact that roughly 10%, slightly more of the population are left-handed. So that reflects simply a matter of statistics. But here, we're not necessarily talking about statistics. The probability of God can't be a matter of statistics. The proportion of gods in the population or something of that sort. So we're talking about degrees of confidence. The degree of confidence we might have in a hypothesis before the evidence starts to come in. So we're just looking at the hypothesis itself, contrasted with the a posteriori probability, the degree of confidence we have in that hypothesis once we do start to consider the evidence. So let's think first about the a priori probability of God's existing or of not existing. So we're not at this stage considering any arguments in favour, we're not at this stage considering evidence for or against, we are simply considering the hypothesis itself. How likely is it to be true? How do we assess this? How do we assess the a priori probability of a hypothesis? Well, arguably it has something to do with simplicity. The more complex a hypothesis, the smaller its a priori probability. Conversely, the simpler hypothesis, the greater its a priori probability. Why is that? Because the complex hypothesis commits to more. It rules out more possibilities than the simpler hypothesis. So consider these three hypotheses here. First of all, the universe exists. Secondly, the universe exists and God exists. And thirdly, the universe exists and God does not exist. Now you might think that the first of these, simply that the universe exists, has a greater chance of being true than number two here, the universe exists and God exists, because 2 has added an extra element. It rules out more possibilities. So the a priori probability of 2 is going to be smaller than that of 1. But we mustn't use that as an argument for thinking that the probability of atheism, the a priori probability of atheism, is going to be greater than that of theism. That would be to conflate 1 and 3. The universe exists and God does not exist does not, on the face of it, look a simpler hypothesis than number 2. And you might be only tempted to think that it is because you're identifying 3 with 1. 1 is actually the more neutral hypothesis. Why should it be more likely, just looking at the nature of the hypothesis itself, that the universe exists and God does not exist, than the universe exists and God exists? what happens when we start to look at the evidence? If we're starting on a fairly level playing field, what happens when the evidence starts to come in? What evidence? Well, there are all sorts of things that you might call upon here. It's a way of deciding whether or not it's more likely that God exists or more likely that God does not exist. So the fact that the universe exists, you might think, speaks somewhat in favour of a creator. That sentient creatures exist, or that consciousness exists, or particularly consciousness with a moral conscience exists, might again speak in favour of a creator with a purpose, against which, of course, the evident fact of suffering. So the evidence looks as though it's going to be quite ambiguous. Now, of course, some of these considerations will push people more in one direction than the other, depending on the weight that they give each particular piece of evidence. But the mere fact that there's evidence that speaks both for and against suggests that it's not, that there's an ambiguity in it. Now, I'm not going to go into detail. Each of these suggests a particular argument, well known to philosophers of religion, for or against the existence of God. But I want to introduce another, or concentrate on another kind of evidence. And that is the evidence of people's own beliefs. That too is part of the data. So, one problem for theism, belief in the existence of God, is what's sometimes referred to as divine hiddenness. God is, in some sense, hidden. Why is it so many people do not believe in God? That's a datum. It calls for some explanation. Why don't they believe in God? Were they conditioned by their upbringing? Were they convinced by an atheistic proof? Or perhaps their own personal experiences, such as relentless suffering? Have they simply failed to consider all the arguments in favour of God? Are they suspicious of religion because of the kinds of atrocity that one might associate with certain religious movements over time? Or are they simply naturally sceptical? Are they the sort of person who will say at regular and tacit intervals, "So you say"? But what about the group of non-believers to which none of these apply? They're not naturally sceptical. They haven't had the kind of suffering in their lives. I mean, they suffered, but not to the extent that they're so sort of emotionally crippled that faith is beyond them. It's not that they're kind of unaware of the arguments on either side. They haven't been particularly conditioned by their upbringing. They seem to be able to think about these things in a kind of free kind of way, and yet they don't believe. Why not? Well, one explanation of that is because there isn't a God. And so, no God to reveal itself to these people. God remains hidden because it doesn't exist. So there's another datum, another piece of evidence that you can add into the mixture. The existence of intelligent, informed, serious, unbiased thinkers who have nevertheless not come to faith in God. Isn't that surprising if God existed? So this argument, if you like, from divine hiddenness is put as an argument in favour of atheism. Well, might seem quite compelling, but the thing is, it's precisely mirrored by a structurally similar datum, which is the existence of people who do believe in God. So you've got this not insignificant group of people who actually believe in God. Why do they believe in God if God didn't exist? Again, can we say it's because they've been conditioned by upbringing, that they've been convinced by a theistic proof, or perhaps a mind-changing religious experience? They've just been zapped in some kind of way, and from that point, anything other than faith is impossible for them. Have they simply failed to consider all the arguments against? Are they uninformed? Have they allowed their religious beliefs to be affected by a purely aesthetic or social side of religion? You know, I like churches, you know, I like the music, I like the language. Are they just naturally credulous? Well, it may be that, as in the other case, one or other of these explanations might apply for certain groups of people. But what about the group of believers to which none of these apply? Again, they haven't been conditioned, they are informed, they have looked at the relevant arguments, they haven't necessarily had the kind of religious experience that makes anything but faith impossible. They're not naturally credulous, and yet they believe in God. And there again you might think there's a datum, the existence of that group of people, which calls for some explanation. And one explanation is, well, God does exist and has in some sense affected their view. Now, I'm not going to endorse either of those arguments, but just point to their cumulative effect, or their joint effect, which is somewhat to cancel each other out. The evidence is ambiguous. Okay, we've got non-believers, and the existence of those informed non-believers might be explained by the non-existence of God, but equally you've got the existence of believers whose belief could then again be explained in terms of the existence of God. The evidence seems to be ambiguous, or at least the sort of data that pulls you in different directions. The cumulative effect of all that is to put one's degree of confidence into more of the sort of the middle position between those two extremes that Dawkins outlined. The sense that one is not prepared to give more credence to theism than to atheism, or vice versa. So much then for what one might say in favour of the agnostic attitude. That's not necessarily an endpoint. You're an agnostic, say. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to just put your feet up at that point? You know, I've done the hard intellectual work, I've thought about all this stuff, and I'm going to be an agnostic. Goodbye. That's the end. Well, no, it's not the end, because there's still an open question about what your attitude towards religion is going to be. And here you might find yourself addressed by two prominent people in the history of this debate. And one of them is Blaise Pascal. And his famous wager. I can't do this justice in my own words, so I'm going to cheat and quote Pascal. It's a well-known passage, but it's worth quoting again. So here's the wager in his Pensée. Either God is or he is not. But to which view shall we be inclined? Reason cannot decide this question. Infinite chaos separates us. At the far end of this infinite distance, a coin is being spun which will come down heads or tails. How will you wager? Reason cannot make you choose either. Reason cannot prove either wrong. So far, so agnostic. Yes, but you must wager. There is no choice, you are already committed. Which will you choose then? Let us weigh up the gain and loss in calling heads that God exists. Let us assess the two cases. If you win everything. If you lose nothing. Do not hesitate then. Wager that he does exist. You want to be cured of unbelief and you ask for the remedy. Learn from those who were once bound like you and who now wager all they have. Follow the way by which they began. They behaved just as if they did believe, taking holy water, having masses said, and so on. That will make you believe quite naturally. So the path to agnosticism that we defined earlier looks like the path of pure reason. But belief in God might yet be rational, even if pure reason cannot decide between theism and atheism, because the benefits of believing God might greatly outweigh the benefits of not. If you win, as Pascal says, you win everything. So this could be put as a challenge to the agnostic. All right, you've reached your agnosticism through reason. Now consider this further thought, that it might be better for you to be a believer than otherwise. And if you find that hard, well, just say the words. Take holy water, have masses said, and so on and so forth. So that's Pascal's wager, and as I said, you can see it as a challenge to the agnostic, a way to get out of your agnosticism without offending reason. Here is what I think of as a sort of very similar kind of appeal. This time, William James, great American late 19th century philosopher and psychologist, and his powerful essay, The Will to Believe. Now, he doesn't seem too keen on Pascal, whom he talks about in his essay. He says, you may think that when it turns to the language of the gaming table, religion really has reached its last trumps. It looks a desperate kind of move. But then James offers us something quite Pascalian, I think. He says, look, if you don't believe, you might not believe because you think that's the rational position to be. You've looked at the reasons for and against. You decided that you're not compelled to believe in the existence of God, and until you are compelled by reason to believe in God, you should not. You should suspend your belief. But, remembering that quotation at the beginning, that our philosophical views, our views in general, are influenced not just by reason, by our passional natures, that is not necessarily irrational. So, is it more rational to be sceptical than to be credulous? Is it to be less influenced by our emotions, by our passions, to be sceptical rather than credulous? Is belief simply a matter of being swept along by our feelings? No, says James. Both scepticism and credulity can be motivated by the passions, by our emotions. The skeptic is a skeptic because they have a fear of being duped, a fear of being mistaken. So they're very cautious in forming their beliefs. That looks just as emotionally motivated a position as the believer, who also allows their passions to influence them, but this time in the other direction. A powerful desire for God to lead to belief in the existence of God. If you remain an agnostic, says James, if you don't let your passions pull you in one direction or another, you have effectively opted for atheism. This is how he puts it. We cannot escape the issue by remaining sceptical and waiting for more light, because although we do avoid error in that way, if religion be untrue, we lose the good if it be true, just as certainly as we positively choose to disbelieve. The agnostic is, for all practical purposes, an atheist, someone who lives without God. So it turns out not to be such a neutral position. Okay, so both Pascal and James are expressing challenges, objections, if you like, to agnosticism, or reason to stop being agnostic. We might have some worries about their arguments, though. So think of Pascal. You'd say, well, look, I'm not sure how I understand how this is supposed to work. You take holy water, you have masses said, you mouth the words. How is that going to lead to faith? You're just going through the motions. But to James, similarly, one could say, well, how can one decide to believe? Belief surely is something that's entirely involuntary, something you find yourself having, perhaps in the light of the evidence, perhaps in the light of other things. You can't decide, surely, to believe. Two worries, then. And here's one way in which you might try and address both. Neither of them refer to fiction, or the role of fiction in leading to religious belief, or religious response, let me put it that way. But here's one way of understanding Pascal's route to religious belief. It's not just a matter of mouthing the words. It's not just a matter of going through the motions. It's a matter of engaging in a game of make-believe. The religious game of make-believe. Let us imagine that there is a God. Let us imagine there is an all-loving being. Let us imagine that we can address this being, that this being is concerned for our welfare, and so on and so forth. In engaging in the religious practices and the religious language, we're not simply going through the motions, we're not simply mouthing the words, we're engaging in religious observance as make-believe. So that's step one. And that's entirely voluntary. To decide to engage in a game of make-believe is entirely involuntary. But then step two, in this possible route to religious faith, is that we immerse ourselves so fully in the religious make-believe that it starts to induce an emotional response in us. Now, we're familiar with this idea of, or the phenomenon of fiction inducing emotional responses. We do get involved in fiction. We do care about fictional characters. Those emotions, in turn, may develop our moral sensibilities. If you're affected by a particularly powerful, though fictional story about the plight of a particular individual, you may find your own moral response to the people around you developed in some particular kind of way, enhanced. And then the third step is to allow that some part of the activity or language may have a real divine object. Simply to allow that as a possibility, rather than saying it's pure fiction, it's pure make-believe. Step four, well, what is step four? Maybe it's faith. Maybe this is a route to religious belief. But you could stop at step three. What is step three? It's effectively a religiously positive agnosticism. It's agnostic in the sense that it doesn't take a definite stand on whether the object of this religious observance, religious language exists or not, but nevertheless it is religiously engaged. That deals, I think, with the worry about Pascal that simply going through the motions can't possibly lead to a genuine religious engagement. It does have content. Engaging in make-believe is to engage in the content of that game. But it also meets the objection to James that belief is entirely involuntary. Engaging in the game of make-believe, which may or may not then lead to religious faith, is itself a voluntary activity. I think this use of religious imagery, of language, to affect our views of the nature of reality is akin to the uses of historical fiction. You may recognise this. A scene from I, Claudius, the television series broadcast in the 1970s with Derek Jacobi as Claudius and John Hurt as Caligula, brilliant Caligula. This was based on a book by Robert Graves. Graves had just translated the 12 Caesars by Suetonius, so it's deeply historically informed, or at least informed by historical document. But of course it's also a fiction. I, Claudius is a fictional book. It's a historical fictional book, based partly on fact, based partly on Graves' own imagination. Some of the words he puts into the mouths of these characters are not likely to be words they actually uttered. But we can be agnostic as to the extent to which I, Claudius represents what actually happened. And although a lot of it is fiction, this might be the closest we can come to enter into this ancient world. It's a window, although fiction, it provides a window onto the past. We, in some sense, get into the minds of these historical characters. And so, religious language, religious activity, although it may be a game of make-believe, it may be a window onto a divine reality. It may or may not. So I think there's a case for agnosticism, and I think also there's a case for a religiously engaged agnosticism. We need not agree with James that agnosticism is effectively atheism. I'm just going to end with a question. So I started saying a few words about my religious education and how by various routes it led me to an agnostic position. But how should we approach religious education? If there is a case for agnosticism, should religious education be pursued on agnostic lines or not? Here are two characters that sort of represent this dilemma. The one on the left is W.B. Galley. In his book, An English School, he describes his own school days and the extent to which his education reflected what one might call the liberal principle in education. The liberal principle in education is that the point of education is not to indoctrinate, but to give the people who are being educated the power to choose their own beliefs when they're in the best position to do so. And this works for a whole range of subjects. Not clear it works for something like mathematics. Mathematical education is not exactly sort of giving you the power to decide whether the square root of 9 is 3 or not. But what about religious education? Here, Galley feels that the attempt at a liberal religious education, a somewhat agnostic religious education, failed. It failed because it ended up being lukewarm. And so not the sort of thing that genuinely gave people the chance to choose a religious faith or necessarily to reject it. The other character is Dr. John Ray, who was headmaster of Westminster School from 1970 to 1986. He was a well-known public figure, often writing for various periodicals. And he too faced this problem of religious education. Westminster, of course, school was attached to the Abbey. Ray would, when headmaster, lead religious services in the Abbey, though an agnostic at the time. Was there any conflict there? His last book, published posthumously, was called An Agnostic's Tale. And he said that at the time, he didn't see any conflict here. He wasn't an atheist, he was an agnostic, and so entirely entitled, as it were, to conduct services. Later he had doubts, and so he set off at the end of his life essentially to stop being an agnostic. He was unhappy with that position. He didn't like a fence-sitting position. Maybe if you're head of the school, when you're required to make a decision, a definite decision, take a moral lead, sitting on the fence is just not a position you particularly find congenial. And he ended up concluding in favour of atheism, not surprisingly. But it is a question, and it's a question that bothers me as an agnostic, as a religiously engaged agnostic. Should that agnosticism be allowed to determine the nature of religious education? Or is it better, as Galli argued, to have genuinely committed religious observance conducted by people who believe thoroughly and not something liberal or lukewarm, or to provide a purely factual historical survey of religious beliefs and moral beliefs? I'm not sure how to answer that question. But I'm just going to sum up with this reflection. Some years ago, the sociologist Robert Towler made a survey of some letters that had been written by members of the public to Bishop John Robinson after the publication of Honest to God in 1963, where he, I suppose, expresses a sort of liberal view of Christianity, modifying the traditional conception of God. Some people were absolutely horrified by that, just as they were horrified by Don Cupitt's The Sea of Faith some 20 years later. But a lot of other people responded positively to it. And Towler thought that all these letters provided a wonderful survey, a snapshot, if you like, of actual religious beliefs among individuals. They weren't necessarily clerics, they weren't necessarily academics, many of them weren't. What was, if you like, ordinary religious belief about? But the interesting thing is, he entitled this survey into religious beliefs, The Need for Certainty. And I just wanted to ask you whether you think that is what religion expresses, the need for certainty. Might a religious path be equally described as the need for an ever-questioning, living uncertainty? Thank you very much.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I want to touch on what I'm going to describe as perhaps the agony of agnosticism.
Yeah.
And I think you know what I mean.
Yes.
I'm a believer. Nothing will ever change that position. I'm settled. There may be atheists in this room who are settled. When I listen to you, I don't get the impression you're settled, and I don't think you want to give that impression either.
No.
And I'd even go so far as, because the existence of God or otherwise is not a trivial matter.
No.
It's a very deep matter for most human beings, or for a lot of human beings. So my question to you is about the agony of agnosticism, because you talked about it in terms of fence sitting, but is it not a very wobbly fence that inevitably, as you get older, and you've got the believer and the non-believer, and you're agnostic, you are on a quest for truth. And that is an uncomfortable position to be. And I don't envy you. Because people, as a believer, people could say, I'm mad. I'm a Christian believer.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say I'm mad, because an atheist may say I'm mad. I'm not going to argue the toss with them. So I wondered if you'd like to comment a little bit on that observation.
Yes. I don't think, incidentally, the agnostic has a monopoly on agony by any means. I think that, the belief can be agonising at times as well. I think the absence of belief can be agonising as well, particularly someone who's lost their belief. That can be an absolutely shattering experience. So there's a lot of agony going on here on all these views. But agnosticism isn't typically presented as an agonising position. I think that's, when Dawkins talks about it, you think, these people that he's got in mind clearly are sort of giving themselves an easy time. It's a kind of a lazy position. You can just sort of put your feet up, I'm not really bothered either way. But I think a sort of really considered, engaged agnosticism is going to be uncomfortable, because it's going to be a constant challenge to you. But I think that's actually a good thing. I mean, I think a lot of human creativity is occasioned by uncertainty. When we're uncertain about something, our imaginations, as it would, get to work. I think that can be a good thing. It struck me reading John Ray's An Agnostic's Tale that he clearly didn't think agnosticism was sort of a valuable position. It's something that you might end up in by default, but somehow not entirely respectable. But I think it does have its advantages. It can lead to kind of a creative thinking, but it's partly the discomfort that it induces that leads to that, because you've got to respond. That's why I say agnosticism is not a stopping point. So you've still got to ask the question: okay, so how are you going to view religion then? Are you going to engage with it or not? And if you do, how?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Thank you for a great talk. I'm not sure if this might be a bit tangential, but it's to do with metaphysics.
Yes.
And I just wondered if you might be a person who could clarify something for me. So I know there's a big question about this two-slit experiment where you seem to be able to influence something in a way that is metaphysical, and I wondered if the point of that, the questions around that thing, is that if we find that things can move in a way that you can't explain through the laws of physics, whether that means or implies that there is therefore a spiritual force that we can't yet explain, and that might be evidence for a god or God, and perhaps for telepathy and things like that.
I think if I were a physicist, which I'm definitely not, I would say that the anomaly of the two-slit slit experiment, where an electron somehow manages to go through both slits simultaneously, which ought to be impossible, is that we need to kind of revise some of our fundamental thinking about the nature of the physical world, rather than thinking, aha, there's a non-physical world out there. So that's always going to be a response. And I think there is a risk of, and this is something that Dawkins himself makes a lot of making the case for God depend on the sort of limitations of our current scientific understanding, because those limits are constantly being pushed back as scientific knowledge expands and so further, and so God is forced into this ever smaller and smaller space. And I think that's actually an unattractive way of looking at things from the theist's point of view, that sort of one's faith is going to depend on some limitation of science, and it would be far better if they were integrated, if you saw science as a way of kind of expressing, or potentially a way of expressing the divine. Certainly that's the way it was regarded, say, in the early 19th century, when many scientific advances were being made. We were wondering, what are the theological consequences of this? And so a series of monographs was commissioned called the Bridgewater Treatise. And the idea was not so much, here's an argument from various scientific sort of scientific advances to the existence of God, but this is a way of kind of celebrating the divine hand in creation in all its wonderful ways. So I think probably it's best, speaking on behalf of the theists, I think it'd be best not to sort of look for gaps in science that God can somehow jump into.
But eventually maybe it will all join up.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, indeed.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the lovely talk. That was really, really interesting. Do you think that it's a kind of problem for the intellectual position of agnosticism that at some point you have to either act in a way that, in a kind of religiously engaged way, as you said, or not? You have to either act in a religious way or not. So at least from kind of a functional, practical position, you're acting as an atheist or agnostic. Do you think that creates a kind of dissonance or undermines agnosticism in an intellectual capacity?
It is a worry that the agnostic who engages in religious observance is risking self-deception in a way, and that doesn't sound very intellectually respectable. But I think, again, we only have to reflect on the way we ordinarily engage with fiction. When we immerse ourselves in a particularly well-written, well-presented fiction, watching a play on stage, for example, I don't think we have to believe that we're deceiving ourselves into thinking that what's happening is the truth, that these aren't actors, this isn't a fiction. And yet, there is that kind of emotional response, a very strong emotional response. There may be some sort of cognitive dissonance there, but I don't think it ever actually becomes self-deception. If that's right about our ordinary engagement with fiction, why could it not be also true of the agnostic engagement in religious practice and observance?
I was very interested in your position of engaged agnosticism, because I feel that is a really exciting way of looking at it. And I live with him, who's a believer, and I am an agnostic. So, but I find, because of that, we have good conversations.
Yeah.
But what I find a lot of because there are many religions and most believe in some sort of divinity, and so there's a lot of different, there's nothing absolute anywhere, or nothing that I think is the truth. So I find the most exciting thing is to be curious and to enjoy the discussions, really.
That's good. It sounds like religious topics in your household are discussed in a slightly more civilised way than they are in my household.
They are lubricated with wine.
Oh, right. It always helps, doesn't it? Because a challenge that's often put to me is, why are you writing about these sort of things if you don't believe it? But also, you mentioned that there are many different kinds of religions. I'm often challenged in my house on the fact that I tend to write specifically about Christianity, or at least about theistic religion. If I'm going to be an agnostic about this, then I ought to be agnostic not just within this very narrow compass, but within the entire compass. And the answer is, of course I am. I am, of course, but my agnosticism isn't limited to that. Nevertheless, when it comes to religiously engaged agnosticism, there you do have to make a choice. You could sort of do the rounds a bit, visit your Buddhist temple on Monday, Catholic church on Tuesday, and so on and so forth. Well, you're looking a bit like a religious tourist that way, rather than someone who's actually engaged in a particular sort of coherent worldview. So I think a choice at that stage has to be... Sorry?
Is that wrong?
No, it's not wrong. It's no. I don't mean... Yeah. It is not wrong. But it might be harder to engage at the kind of level that would then induce the sort of emotions that then would develop your own moral sensibilities. That's the thing. Now, it may work for some people. Others might want to identify themselves more with a particular expression of religious faith, in part because of their cultural upbringing, which seems to be a perfectly legitimate reason to choose one particular kind of religious observance rather than another, or indeed for aesthetic reasons, because the aesthetic reasons aren't irrelevant here. Our aesthetic response to religious imagery, language, architecture, art, and so on and so forth, is part of the mechanism which induces those emotions, which can then be employed in one's sort of moral thinking. So the agnosticism is sort of fairly wide-ranging across, lots of different kinds of religions, but I think the religiously engaged agnosticism, for me at any rate, tends to take a particular form. And despite what is often said to me in my household, I maintain that that's a defensible position.
Actually, that lady's question kind of covers mine. I was going to ask what your position was on other religions, all religions, and if your thoughts still apply to all.
Yes, I mean, I focus specifically on the existence of God because that, I think, is what the agnosticism is about. But even within theistic religions, you've got lots of other variations as well on other things, like the nature of the incarnation, for example. Is the incarnation a feature of this religion, or isn't it? Is it treated as purely symbolic, or is it treated as effectively a metaphysical hypothesis that God becomes man, and so on and so forth? When you look at non-theistic religions, these tend to be sort of less doctrinal. So they're sort of more based on sort of practice rather than necessarily a kind of particular worldview. So it's where you've got a distinctive worldview that agnosticism becomes a sort of option. really. Agnosticism is a sort of stance of neutrality towards a particular proposition. But you may have a kind of religion that doesn't emphasise the propositional, making assertions about the nature of reality, but it's more to do with how you engage with others and the world.
Thanks, Robin. That was fantastic. I want to understand a few of the details about what it is to be religiously engaged.
Yes.
And I'll come to the end of this, and this relates to some of the last questions. I think your agnosticism only works with the sort of wishy-washy Anglicanism we have nowadays. And you couldn't pull it off with most other religions. So here's the fundamental problem. You talk about religious practice and religious observance. So you're thinking there about ritual, practice, custom. And it's perfectly reasonable to be engage in some sort of make-believe and find ritual, practice and custom giving you the emotional depth you need in your life to make other decisions elsewhere. But religion goes beyond that. It goes to a body of doctrine, which, with perhaps the exceptions of your particular choice of religion, have very specific determinations about how you live your life and how you make decisions in your life. And it seems that to engage in a game of make-believe parallel to some sort of fiction, and then take out of that fiction a set of clear instructions on how to make decisions, concrete decisions which affect other people in your life, that's verging on the self-deception or the crazy or whatever. So it's what seems to make it possible for you is that you're operating in a religion which gives you the freedom to make a lot of those decisions on the basis of your emotional response to the practice, rather than offering you a set of doctrines.
Well, I don't want to say the doctrines aren't important, because that is what, in part, gives the religion its content. But that's like saying, well, the plot of a fiction is important. You can't take out these things, the fact that this happens first, and then this happens, and that happens. That is part of what the fiction is. It's part of the identity of the fiction. But you think that I may be sort of using the doctrine in a kind of suspicious way. I'm using the sort of doctrines to generate a set of imperatives, if you like. I should do this. But then taking it out of its realist. Oops.
So you just need to look at different versions of Christianity before we get to different religions. The impact of religious observance in Anglicanism on your everyday decisions about your life, your family, how you engage in politics, is very different from the impact on those decisions of Catholicism. And so you have chosen a religion which gives you space as an agnostic to not have to apply those things. If I can engage, I love Shakespeare. I feel it can stimulate my emotions and my ability to think about difficult choices in my life. But if I took that as doctrine, like someone might take the Sermon on the Mount as doctrine, instruction on how to live your life, that's crazy. It's fiction. It's a stimulus to thought, not a body of moral doctrine.
So, the thought is that in engaging with the religion, I'm also engaging in the explicitly moral part of that religion. It's not that here are some interesting images they make me want to do this rather than that. But here are some instructions that I've been given, and engaging with that religion means following those instructions. And if I treat those as fictional, then I'm not. Then why am I following them? And if I don't, then I'm not really engaging with the religion. So I think I want to make a distinction between what one might say the sort of the metaphysical content, doctrinal content of religion. What it says about the world. This is how the world is constituted. This is what exists. This is the nature of what exists. And on the other hand, this is what you should do. The moral content. So I'm thinking of the sort of game of make-believe, as a game of make-believe, to be directed particularly at the first of those. This picture of the world is fictional. I don't think that can be comfortably applied to the moral injunctions that these are just fictional. Because to say these are fictional is to say, well, you don't need to follow them. So you may be right that it's easier to take this kind of view of a religion which goes fairly light on the sort of moral side, as it were. Not that you do what you like, but there are certain things that, as it were, are absolutes, but otherwise you've sort of got a fairly wide sense of freedom. But I think the proposal, treated as a game of make-believe, is perhaps best applied to the sort of what one might call the purely metaphysical content, rather than the moral content. And if the moral content is sort of relatively light or sort of somewhat unspecific, that's what makes it wishy-washy in your view, is it?
Well, and that's what's distinctive.
Yes. Gives one a fair bit of freedom, is how I'd rather put it, in more positive ways.
In a sense, this is a question or a comment on Tom as much as for you, Robin. And you and I, in our youth and me on into my adulthood, were both very influenced by an agnostic Jewish scientist. It was your mention of Shakespeare and the thinking of the resonance of those words. And I think, one of the things that surprised me at the end of his life was the way in which those words from his childhood came back. So one of the very last things that he and I did together was that he taught me how to say the Shema in Hebrew, which I had no idea he could remember it. But it was, like a speech from Hamlet, just kind of comes pouring out. And so I think that make-believe stuff, I kind of get that, but I think a lot of it is to do with really embedded language and the rhythm of language. And I think a huge, and that's why the King James Bible is so important and why nothing else will really do, not even for Richard Dawkins.
Yes.
and I think that's quite an interesting way of thinking about it. To what extent is this actually a problem of the philosophy of language as much as it's a problem of the philosophy of religion?
Well, it's true that some language just works better than others. And I think an attempt to rewrite the Bible in purely humanist terms leads to something really pretty disappointing. It's certainly not memorable in the way that the words of the authorised version, or in the example that you gave. These are memorable.
I have no idea whether Harry believed that, but it was necessary for him to use those words.
Yes, that's right. That is the sort of the ritual element, isn't it? That's the important thing. There's, in a sense, a script which invites us in. Uttering that script is in part what it is to engage in that. calling it a game sounds like I'm trivialising it, but it is a sort of activity where we're not asking too closely. Is this then to be taken a literal reflection of reality?
Right, thank you. Just interested in something you mentioned earlier, unless I misunderstood you, but I consider myself a Christian in that I believe in God or a God, but I do not, and have never felt, I mean, when I was a young child, I felt an imperative to go to church every Sunday, etc. As you say, I was brought up in that way. But as an adult now, I do not feel an imperative to do that. I still consider myself a Christian. So would you say it's possible to do that if I'm not feeling an imperative to engage in the religious activities? Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, you might think that these other activities are just props for someone who don't feel the need to. You don't feel the need to. No, that's right. But you would describe your position as one of belief.
I do.
Yeah.
So perhaps it comes down to just a faith, but I don't
Yeah.
feel an imperative to do that.
No.
I don't,
No.
just because it says in the Bible you need to do this, this and this. Ideally, I just don't, but my feelings are just as passionate as someone else's.
Yeah.
My belief is just as passionate.
So you could have certainly one can have a faith, a belief that doesn't require this other element.
I just see it as probably a bad thing to say in public, but I just see that a large part of the Bible are just opinions that have been passed down over. Obviously, everyone's opinion is valid, but I don't. It hasn't, just because I don't believe everything the Bible says. I still have a passionate belief in God and Christianity.
Yes.
And that God existed and died on the cross.
But you find yourself responsive, nevertheless, to certain kinds of symbols, things that you would recognise as symbols.
I do, and I can absolutely remember that you alluded to earlier, the comfort and being brought up in that manner as a child. But I've managed to let that go. I've been able to let that go for years. And whereas I went through a stage of feeling incredibly really guilty if I didn't go to church one Sunday. And then as you get married and you have children and you take on other responsibilities, I had a real emotional struggle letting that go. Just letting it go. And now I'm glad to say I feel much happier now I've let that go. And I don't feel a sense of guilt anymore.
No. And that doesn't make you any less religiously engaged.
Robin, I'm going to move a question here in a second.
Right. Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Another questions are buzzing in my head. The question I will ask though is, you began by wondering what the topic of your lecture would be, and I just wondered.
Well, it was more the title.
The title, yes, and then the content. And so I wonder if your title would be, or how similar would your lecture be if the title was "Why I Am an Anti-Vaxxer," because it can seem to contain a lot of the emotions that people. I mean, I'm of the scientific sort who believe in vaccine. I've been double jabbed, treble jabbed, but there are people who are anti-vaccination, and they will, with a huge emotional content, which is what I think you were saying about the emotions involved in believing. And I just wonder whether this lecture should have been sponsored by the equivalent of the Royal Institute of Psychology rather than the Institute of Science, because the philosophy of religion that I was taught many years ago would have been Aquinas' 5 proofs, the ontological argument, stuff like that, where you knock about word in the sense of words, but also reason. Whereas this stuff that we've heard this evening is about, and nothing wrong with that. And I'm very grateful for the quotes from William James about the whole, we're informed by our passions. So I just wonder if how similar your lecture would have been if it had been that.
I think that would have been quite a different lecture. I mean, I hope I haven't given the impression, although I'm sympathetic to James when he says our views are determined not simply by our reason, but in part by our passional nature, because reason only takes us too far. Although I'm sympathetic to that view, I'm not. I wouldn't want to say is, look, you can just believe what you feel is right. You know, never mind the evidence, never mind the objective reasons that could be put in favour of your view. You know, what's your gut feeling here? And that's absolutely fine. Nothing I've said, I hope, licenses that kind of approach. But remember, this is a talk about agnosticism, right? That's the key thing. So the question is, what does the agnostic do with their emotions? Is it, as James is suggesting, is it to lead one to belief, or is it to maintain one's neutrality, but permit one to nevertheless engage in certain kinds of language, in certain kinds of viewpoint? Certain kinds of language.
I just wondered if the etymology of agnosticism is against knowledge, whereas all the bit is about belief and the foundations of belief. And how useful is that distinction between?
To say against knowledge is slightly misleading. I mean, so when T.H. Huxley started using this word, agnostic, he was contrasting his position with what he thought of as the Gnostic position, that one could have absolute certainty in religious matters. And he said the agnostic thinks that one can't have certainty on religious matters. It's not sort of against knowledge, but it may be against claims to knowledge.
Well, it's a testament to the engagement of your agnosticism that we are in danger of overrunning. So we must stop now, and may I invite you to thank Robin Lepedfin for a fascinating talk.